Good afternoon, Minister, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Julie Sinnamon and I am the Chair of European Movement Ireland. And on behalf of all of us at AMI Ireland, it's a pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to this very timely event, a new deal on corporation tax. We're delighted to bring you such a distinguished panel of speakers who will share their insights and expertise in a few moments. I want to thank the BDO team on behalf of everybody from AMI Ireland, and a particular thanks to our former AMI Brussels branch chair and a European Movement International board member, Noel Clahan. Noel is the Global Head of Regulatory and Public Policy at the BDO Global Office in Brussels, and he was instrumental in getting this event off the ground. So thank you to Noel and the BDO. For over 65 years, European Movement Ireland's mission has been to develop the connection between Ireland and Europe and to achieve greater public understanding of the issues that affect the relationship in both directions. The OECD Agreement on Global Tax is a milestone on many levels, and Ireland's support marks a major change in one of the fundamental aspects of our economic policy. Implementation of the agreement at EU level over the coming months and years will have implications for European governments and businesses. And given the importance of this OECD agreement, we were keen to facilitate a discussion on what that would be informative and shed light on what will happen going forward. I wish to thank our guests for giving their time and expertise. I certainly appreciate how busy their schedules are and the commitment, so we're absolutely delighted to have such a fantastic panel. We're joined today by the Minister for Finance, Pascal Donahue, TD, who needs no introduction. Pascal Saint-Amans, Director of the Centre for Tax Policy and Administration in the OECD. Kevin Doyle, Tax Partner in BDO Ireland, and Monika Loving, from a tax partner in BDO US, and Mary Cosgrove from NUI Galway. Very shortly, I'll hand you over to our capable and accomplished moderator, Suzanne Lynch of Political Europe. And Suzanne will be familiar to many of you as a former Washington and Brussels correspondent of the Irish Times, where she has covered issues under discussion today for a long time. Last September, Suzanne took up her new role in Political Brussels as the playbook author. And finally, if you or your organisation are interested in joining European Movement Ireland and support our work, I would encourage you to look at our website, which is www.europeanmovement.ie, where you'll find details about our work and more upcoming events, and I'd encourage you to join and become a member. But for now, it is my pleasure to thank you again and to hand over to Suzanne Lynch.
Thank you very much, Julie. Thanks for that introduction. Great to be with everyone this afternoon for this seminar, and thank you to European Movement Ireland and BDO for organising it. And as Julie said, I have been covering tax matters as a journalist for a longer time than I care to remember. Just a bit about how we'll structure this today. We will begin by hearing from our two main speakers. That's the Minister for Finance, Pascal Donahue, who is also the President of the Eurogroup, group of Eurozone finance ministers, and also from Saint-Amans of the OECD. So after they have finished speaking, we will then turn to our panel, and we're going to hear from Kevin and Monika from BDO, who will bring a perspective from BDO Ireland and the US, and of course Mary Cosgrove of NUI Galway. We do encourage you to ask questions, so you can do that on social media channels or email into events@europeanmovement.ie. So thank you again for joining. And with that, I will turn over to the Minister, Minister Donohoe. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Suzanne, and good afternoon to everyone. I also want to begin by expressing my gratitude to European Movement Ireland for inviting me to speak at this important event. European Movement Ireland plays a vital role in improving the Irish public's understanding of our relationship with the European Union, our European partners, and indeed facilitating dialogue on important international issues. This fostering of debate is even more important given the extraordinary times that we are living in. Now, these times are extraordinary in a number of different ways, but clearly a defining feature of our era is the COVID pandemic and how it has posed such a serious challenge to policymakers and to citizens. The ability of our society and our economy to respond back to this pandemic does demonstrate what we can achieve together collectively, both at national level and at European level. And while this pandemic has indeed been a monumental challenge and one where we have shown what we can achieve by working together, it has demonstrated to us and reminded us of other key global challenges. And one of those clearly is the current status of international tax rules. These taxes fund vital public services. They are important for the investment climate and more broadly are very important policy levers. However, the tax system and particularly business taxes operate within a global framework and thus they need to work in harmony inside that global environment. I think it's well understood by now that the current international tax rules, which indeed have their origins in work underway in the League of Nations in the early part of the last century, have been creaking under the weight of digitalization and globalization in recent years. They clearly need structural reform. While we have had success in recent years in addressing, for example, the challenge of base erosion and profit sharing, and indeed Ireland has made many reforms to our tax code to reflect these new international norms developed at the OECD, it's also the case that a key structural element of the framework needed to be addressed. And that was the issue of the tax challenge that arises from the digitalization of the global economy. The existing tax framework was built for a different era, that of bricks and mortar. And it has been evident to all that we need a global tax system for the digitalized world we now live in. On the 8th of October, Ireland joined 135 other jurisdictions in reaching a historic two-pillar agreement on addressing the tax challenges arising from the global economy. I believe that this agreement represents a fair compromise, reflecting the interests of the many countries involved in the negotiations, large and small, developed and developing. It will be a global agreement, implemented consistently by all in a timely manner, underpinning the required certainty and stability in the international tax framework to support future investment decisions. The EU Commission has provided welcome assurances that the directive it will shortly propose to transpose the OECD agreement will be faithful to that agreement and not go beyond this consensus. Importantly also, the agreement will continue to support innovation and growth, acknowledging the need for innovation incentives, such as in the area of research and development. This is critical because innovation, technology were key elements in the remarkable response to the pandemic, from the development of vaccines and management of our vaccination rollout program to the seamless transition of remote working and businesses adopting to their business models moving online. Tax systems need to be able to support innovation to bring more benefits to more when we face a changing future. As a small and open economy, it is essential that Ireland adopts and evolves in line with the changes in the international agreement. So I'm going to restate the case regarding why Ireland should be in this agreement. Firstly, if we weren't in the agreement, we would have been unable to participate in the ongoing critical discussions, which will continue apace in the coming weeks and months on the implementation rules. Failure to sign up to an agreement would have resulted in continued uncertainty for businesses operating in Ireland. I have indicated for some time now that there will be a cost to Ireland arising from this agreement, and my officials and the Revenue Commissioner have estimated that this will be up to €2 billion annually when both pillars come into effect. This is clearly not insignificant. However, I have no doubt that the upsides of being in a historic international agreement far outweigh the downsides of staying out. It is a complex, even a challenging decision, but I firmly believe it is the right one. Our tax model will remain stable. It will remain competitive. It's now part of a broader economic model. Our membership of the European Union and single market, the quality of our education, and the skills and innovation of workers in Ireland. Ireland must be part of global and European efforts to respond to the complex challenges that we all face together, as we work together with multiple and historic rhythms of change converging in our time. Our values, our heritage, and our future means that Ireland should be influencing and shaping international agreements, not be outside of them. To make good on our multilateral commitments, to provide stability and certainty in the international tax framework, we must ensure that implementation respects the letter and spirit of the agreement. And I believe that this agreement will provide the long-term stability and certainty that the international tax framework needs. I want to recognise the pivotal work of the OECD, of the Secretary General, Matthias Cormann, but in particular, I want to recognise the role of Pascal Saint-Amans and his centrality to what we have achieved. And while I won't pretend for a moment that the work and negotiation in this process was always easy, I equally want to recognise that Pascal has made a pivotal and essential contribution to the achievement of what I believe is a historic agreement. And I and Ireland have been proud to be part of the OECD story from the beginning. The 6 decades of the OECD have coincided with Ireland's own economic and social transformation as we opened up at home and as we opened out to the world. The OECD has been a good friend to Ireland, and I like to believe we have made important contributions to their work. This international tax agreement, which has been led by the OECD, has been challenging, as any important process is, but it has demonstrated the value of multilateralism at a time in which the world needs to be reminded of its value and of its utility. The value of countries working together to address shared challenges. There will be more challenges, of course there will, but we can see that the OECD, through its work, can play a key role in assisting countries to address those challenges. And as the dust settles on this phase of the international tax agreement, it's evident that we need to focus our minds on the other great challenge of our era, of climate change. The effects we face from climate change are clear for all to see, and it is timely, given the recent COP26 meeting across the Irish Sea in Scotland, for us to consider again how we can do more. This is a global problem. It requires all of us to work together to transition to a carbon neutral economy and society. Just as we did to address issues that arose from the international tax framework, we can again look to the OECD to help drive a globally collaborative approach. We can clearly recognise the role that the OECD can play in developing sustainable policy solutions, including, for example, green budgetary frameworks and innovative carbon pricing tools. And I welcome the leadership shown by Secretary General Corman in turning the organisation's attention to this. Ireland wants to be and is ambitious in addressing climate change. We were among the first to implement a carbon tax in 2010, and we have now legislated to incrementally increase our carbon tax to €100 per tonne of CO2 by 2030. In addition, we are ring-fencing the tax revenues from this tax for use in green public spending to manage the transition to and invest in a low carbon future. Our government's climate action plan shows the change that will happen across our country. And we are committed to achieving this in a just way, meaning all voices will be heard in a fair and equal manner, doing our very best to ensure that no one is left behind. Carbon pricing is a key aspect of our overall decarbonisation strategy. And the work that is happening at OECD level, the work that is happening at EU level, points to how we can price, monitor and fund this necessary transition. I'm confident we can work together within the European Union and at the OECD to address climate change, just as we have made progress on such a critical international tax challenge. Thank you.
And now over to you, Pascal Saint-Amans, please.
Thank you very much, and thanks to European Movement Ireland for this invitation. Thanks a lot to Pascal Donahue, the Minister, for his very nice words, and beyond the very nice words, the firm action, firm negotiation and participation, and for his vision. I could repeat what the Minister has so rightfully said. I will try to provide a slightly different angle and maybe get slightly more into the details of the agreement. But I think we are in full agreement with the vision provided by Pascal Donahue. What's the background and why do we have change and why have we faced that sea change which has occurred? I think it's always good to go back to the basics and the fundamentals. 2008, I think, is critical in that sense because it was a wake-up call for the leaders, the governments across the world that the economy had changed, that we're facing a global, massive financial crisis, and that globalization, which had brought so many good things, was also in need for some form of regulation, in particular in the tax area. And I think I would date back to 2008, 2009, the time where governments decided to take action. Pascal Donahue said it, the international tax rules, which were very limited to try to articulate different tax sovereignties, were elaborated 1 century ago by the League of Nations. 1 century later, almost, these rules proved largely outdated because they were designed in a closed economy environment, and they were now used in an environment with open economies with no borders. The problem with the rules is that they did facilitate base erosion, profit shifting, and they, as a result of the global financial crisis, did raise some tensions between countries. There were two ways out of these tensions. One was a cooperative, multilateral approach which the OECD has tried to push, and the other alternative was that countries would try to protect their sovereignty, their lost sovereignty through globalization, by taking unilateral measures, which would have been detrimental to the economy at large and to the small open economies in particular. And that's why the OECD, which strongly believes in growth, in employment, in facilitating cross-border investments, the OECD has tried to provide a hub, a platform for facilitating the discussion. And it's against that background that work was done, first to put an end to bank secrecy, to ensure better transparency and proper and fair exchange of information across nations, which now has become a reality with automatic exchange of information, and then embarked in the work on base erosion and profit shifting. And I must say that we've always had extremely strong support from Ireland in this work, while it was not an easy process for Ireland to face this situation where countries, large taxing countries, wanted to recover their sovereignty at the detriment of smaller open economies. We've had support throughout BEPS, and as the minister said, we had to complete that work, in particular as regarded the tax challenges of the digitalization of the economy. The outcome of that is this two-pillar agreement. Pillar one is about a new taxing right, which is based on a formula, reallocating a quarter of the rent of the largest companies in the world so that market jurisdictions would get what they will consider a fairer share of the profit of these largest multinational companies. You know that the threshold is 20 billion euros of turnover annually, as well as profit before tax at least 10%, with a view to reducing the threshold to 10 billion and still 10% of profit before tax 7 years after the entry into force of the agreement. So a new taxing right, a new nexus, meaning that these companies will be taxable even where they do not have a permanent establishment in another country. But this comes together with improved tax certainty. And the minister was very clear on the fact that the goal of this agreement is to provide a stabilization of the system and to improve tax certainty for those who will be in scope. This is absolutely key to increase business adherence to the deal and make sure that we move into a pro-growth approach here. So that's what Pillar 1 is about. New taxing right, a new nexus, and new and strong tax certainty. Pillar 2 is about establishing a global minimum tax, the effective rate of which is 15%. Together with a subject to tax rule, tax experts will know what a subject to tax rule. It's a way to ensure that countries don't lose some taxing right in the treaties that they had concluded where their partners does not exercise that taxing right. And this was a very strong requirement from developing countries. As was said, we have 137 members which have joined this political agreement, which means that this deal is balanced between the views of the large economies and the smaller economies, between developed economies, emerging and developing economies. Ireland joined this, and I think the minister will take as a compliment to say that Ireland was difficult because Ireland had high stakes there, and Ireland did fight the right fights in a very constructive manner, but being extremely demanding, and so should Ireland be. And we're extremely grateful that Ireland was able to move, and grateful also for being demanding, because an agreement is good only when all the countries can agree, because they are sufficiently happy and unhappy at the same time with the outcome. And I think it took the fact that your finance minister is so well respected throughout Europe and the world for his vision, for his action in the Eurogroup, and for all the good work he's done in Ireland, to be listened to by his partners, and to have a serious influence. What are the next steps? We first need to implement the deal, which takes to elaborate a model domestic legislation for the implementation of Pillar 2. And we hope to finalize this model domestic legislation in the coming weeks, so that the European Union Commission can take it and translate it into a directive. And the minister welcomed the fact that the European Commission indicated it will stick to the agreement as reflected on the 8th of October statement, as well as with the domestic draft rules, which will be approved by the membership of the inclusive framework. As regards Pillar 1, this new reallocation of taxing right, it is recognized that we do need a multilateral convention to establish the new taxing right, to establish the new nexus, to establish the new tax certainty rules. And we'll have until early 22, a few months, to elaborate this multilateral convention, for it to be signed by the members at the latest in June 2022. So an extremely demanding timeline, but with a very strong political dynamic. I would like to conclude with 3 words. The first word is about the fact that this new environment is here to provide stability in a multilateral context. So multilateralism is key. And I think that the tax story over the past 13, 14 years has been a success story for all countries, the G20, but also the smaller economies, by establishing a cooperation. And when you look at the alternative, which was kind of a tax war, which would have resulted in trade tensions or trade war, we're much better off with multilateralism. The second word is about carbon pricing. I'm extremely glad that the minister referred to our project to establish a new inclusive framework to address the issue of carbon pricing. The world will not decarbonize without pricing carbon, and we need to bring all the countries together, because they are not leading the charge, as is the case with Ireland. You have a number of countries not having a price tag on carbon emission, and that's where we need to move, but we need to bring all the countries together to find the right path, and we know we can count on Ireland. The last word is to thank you for the invitation, to thank the ministers for his very nice word, and more importantly, for the commitment of Ireland and the very hard work of his and his team. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for that, and for those 2 very clear statements about the situation now as it stands relating to this historic corporate tax deal. We will now move to our broader panel, and again would encourage people on the call to place any questions they want to, as I said, events@europeanmovement.ie, or on the European Movement social media channels on Twitter, etc. Just to start our discussion, I think I'll begin with you, Kevin. Kevin, who's well known to some of you, Kevin Doyle with BDO in Ireland. Listen, Kevin, just to start this off, what has been the reaction of business to this breakthrough announcement on tax?
Thank you, Suzanne. And if I could actually just firstly start by, on behalf of BDO, commending the Minister for Finance, Pascal Donahue, for the huge political effort. It's clear from even listening to the dialogue so far, huge political effort put in to achieve a position here that Ireland could come to the table on all of this. It seems in particular over July to September, when the at least wording was removed from the 15% rate in Pillar 2, that allowed the position for what the Minister has said was a fair compromise. But at the same time, I think that the support of Minister Donahue's peers in Europe to retain the 12.5% rate for the majority of Irish-based businesses has been really important as well. Secondly, if I could congratulate Mr. Pascal Saint-Amans on the success in having 137 countries and jurisdictions, as he said, they're already signed up to the deal. No doubt also that took huge effort from him himself personally and the OECD. So congratulations to all involved. The business reaction, I suppose, we found it to be broadly positive on the political agreement. There's no doubt it has been complex and concerning for business over the last number of years, in particular as disputes have arisen cross-border, as unilateral measures have been implemented. So getting back to what business craves, which is certainty, as this deal is implemented, is really what business is supportive of. However, we like to say in tax that the devil is in the detail. So of course, as per usual, everybody is eagerly awaiting the releases that we've mentioned are coming in the coming weeks and coming months, and I think they will be looked at in detail by everybody involved. So we can't wait for that. Honing in maybe on the Irish business reaction in particular, I said already I wouldn't underestimate how important and how positive it was to retain the 12.5% rate as well for the majority of Irish-based businesses. I think if those businesses had a further headwind of a change in base, a change in rate, and all the complexity that inevitably will come with getting into the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 detail and ultimately pulling that through, that would have been very difficult for all businesses if they were pulled into it. So we still have that as well to call upon, I suppose, for FDI in Ireland. There's a lot of emerging businesses that would look to Ireland as a gateway to Europe, and they can have the certainty that the 12.5% rate is still there as they grow and as they expand their headcount maybe around the world. Business in Ireland is always looking at the US as well. So given that we have a lot of US parented Irish subsidiaries, I think how things come in the US is going to be very important. So maybe Monika, you're probably better placed to talk about that.
Yeah, exactly. And Monika, would you like to come in there? Look, what's been the reaction on your side of the pond to this deal that was struck with lots of fanfare a couple of weeks ago? We saw President Biden lining up with all these global leaders down in Rome to announce this detail. So what's this deal? What's been the reaction there?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, everyone. To echo the earlier comments, the U.S. business reaction is very supportive, really focusing in on the areas that were touched on, in the earlier addresses. Certainty, stability for the tax posture of international business is very welcome. There certainly is the acknowledgement on more work to be done in the technical details around implementation, anxiously awaiting those. But this is seen as a very well-received starting point. It provides U.S. multinationals with that guidepost on what could happen outside the U.S. with regard to international taxation, while we watch what's happening in Washington on potential for U.S. tax reform. Given our strong connection between Ireland and the U.S., those multinationals that have a strong business focus in Ireland really welcomed Ireland's participation in the global deal. It goes back to the emphasis on certainty.
Yeah. Look, just you mentioned it there. One of the big unknowns here or questions people have is how this is going to go down in the US Congress. Lots of tax changes over the last few years and talk around this in Washington. How do you read things at the moment in terms of political support and the political direction of the possibility of getting this through on the US side?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Suzanne, I think it's interesting, and I guess explain from the US side. I think there are probably two different paths to discuss, right? Pillar 1 versus Pillar 2 would likely take different paths from an implementation perspective. I'll actually start first with Pillar 2 because there's current activity, right, in Washington that touches in this area. We do have proposed legislation making its way through our legislative process right now that could more closely align our U.S. global low tax and tangible income rules, or so-called GILTI rules, with the Globe framework. And this would happen through a change to US domestic law. Those negotiations are ongoing. We expect to see continued activity, in the coming weeks and months. By way of context, in the US, for that proposed legislative bill to become law, it would need to pass a vote in both chambers of the US Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, before the president receives the bill. So as it currently stands, that proposed legislation is with the House, going through some additional procedural steps there, and we'll watch that very closely in the weeks to come. Those changes on the GILTI regime would be intended to more closely align to Globe and produce, when taken together with a number of the proposed adjustments, approximately a 15% effective rate, an increase from the current rate at 10.5%. Moving to a country-by-country application of the GILTI regime and making some adjustments on the exemption for tangible assets. So interesting to watch on Pillar 2. That's where we're seeing activity right now.
Great, yeah, and I think I saw that Biden obviously had a very, very tight majority in the two houses. Kirsten Sinema, one of the Democrats to watch in Senate, has suggested she will support it, so that's a good sign. But just, Minister, maybe I'll just bring you in on this before I get to Mary. I know this was a concern on the Irish side. Should Ireland sign up to this deal when there was an unknown in the US? And what's your read of it now? I know you met and hosted Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, in Dublin recently. So what's your read of things about how this is going to play out in the US?
Thanks, Suzanne. Well, I'm very cautious about commenting on political processes or systems in other countries, particularly in our friends in the United States of America, because you have to recognise their right to have their debates and make their own decisions. But with that caveat said, I'm confident that we are going to see a period of very significant political activity in the US that will lead to the kind of change that in turn, I believe, will give all the members of the OECD the confidence to go ahead and implement this agreement across next year. So it is, to be open about it, and it's clearly the case that, of course, many countries look up to what are happening in the larger countries to see how the pace is being set in the implementation of a global agreement like this. But my expectation is that the United States will be at the fore in making it happen. And the US are our friends, they're our partners. I like to think that President Biden would still have called the Irish rugby team, regardless of what happened in the international tax architecture. But they are our friends, they're our global partners, and clearly we have a shared interest in tackling this challenge together.
Thank you. Just bringing in Mary from NUI Galway. Look, I mean, just generally, there's lots of talk about this being an historic deal. I mean, is it really historic? I mean, a lot had been changing anyway with BEPS, etc. But how do you read this as an expert analyst of these kind of changes in the tax systems?
Historic is an understatement. In the whole idea of international tax, this is a whole new area. As Pascal Saint-Amans mentioned, 100 years ago, the League of Nations tried to start setting up a system. The OECD actually had to come in there because there was difficulty getting consensus and started creating bilateral tax treaties. But up until really the BEPS process, international tax was a little bit of a misnomer. There were no multilateral conventions. There was no sort of customary international tax law. We now have one multilateral convention, and we're talking about more. This is huge. We are also, I believe, moving into an era of the creation of customary international tax law, where we have moved, as been mentioned, from the idea of the supremacy of tax sovereignty for countries to a move against unilateral measures, and a concept that, while we don't want double taxation, that double non-taxation is also now not allowable. And I think, although we're talking about certainty for businesses and the very large businesses for the next few years with this agreement, a door has been opened, and as part of this we're going to see the whole focus of tax change a lot. With Pillar 1 we're seeing for the first time sort of some formulary apportionment, a little bit, 25% of some of the profits are going to be reallocated based on a formula. We've seen the EU try and fail for years to bring in formulary apportionment. It's happening now. So the power of this, backed by the number of countries behind it, means that, well, for us tax nerds, this is the most exciting time to be alive.
Just to return to some of that detail, I mean, Kevin, what are there's a lot of, you said yourself, the devil's in the detail. What are you looking out for in the next few weeks and months here? What are kind of certain pitfalls, or what should businesses be aware of? I'm not asking you to have a crystal ball, but where should we be looking in the coming weeks?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the coming weeks are focused, it seems, on Pillar 2 and seeing the model details and the EU directives. So I suppose in an Irish context, where we're speaking with clients, it's about the innovation. The Minister has spoken about how important incentives and innovation still are. So a lot of dialogue is going on about how exactly will the R&D credits, I suppose, still be retained and maintained. Is it above the line? We're going to have to go with something that requires legislative change. Can we do it without going back to the EU and considering kind of state aid coverage when it comes to R&D credits? When it comes to things like our capital allowances and 291A, again, conceptually they come in and they follow the accounting principles. However, of course, there can be situations depending on life of the asset where you're writing it off not quite in line with your account. So you can get into timing differences, carry forwards, how will losses forward come into play. So I'll leave it maybe there and let others start coming in. But that whole area of innovation, and I think exactly how it'll come through is being watched closely.
Anything there, Monika or Mary, on that? What you're looking out for?
I'm quite interested in how exactly accounting profits will be used. We have different accounting standards around the globe. My accounting colleagues are the accounting standards bodies haven't normally been this interested in tax. It may see a new era of earnings management to try and fit the right tax result. So the accounting element and how the accounting standard setting bodies will deal with this will be very interesting.
Great. Monika, anything there from you on that?
Yeah, of course. Maybe to add in another angle, that base of taxation, right? As Mary mentioned, the financial accounting starting point, but then the differences from there. What adjustments to that financial statement accounting would be made as a part of the base.
Yeah, thanks. Just to bring in Pascal Saint-Amans there, and one of the issues we talked there, we touched on the reality of trying to get this through the US political system. What about in Europe? I mean, you mentioned there that I'm speaking to you here from Brussels, and the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen have said she's plans to come forward a directive or a proposed text. I think it's the week beginning December 20th, just before Christmas. And with the idea that this will get agreed during France takes over the rotating presidency in January. And we all know, let's be honest, what France's view on this. They will love to get a deal on tax during their presidency. They're already saying that they want this done. Now, Ireland, and it's not just Ireland, but other countries. I mean, the minister said there, I think the phrase the minister, Mr. Donahue, used was faithful to the agreement, that they're confident, they've got assurances that the European Commission will not try to add things or change things to what was agreed earlier this year. How do you read that going? Are you confident that is what's going to happen, that there's going to be a fairly straightforward process at the EU level?
The answer is a plain yes, for two reasons. One, because they said so, and two, because if they were tempted not to do so, and I don't believe they will be tempted, but the Commission proposes and the members decide, and this requires unanimity. And I think it was very clear to everybody in the deal reached at the OECD that countries, when implementing that deal, or group of countries like the European Union, would have to stick to the agreement. And I think Pascal Donahue has been crystal clear, and he's not at all isolated here. I mean, it's a common position that there is a deal, which was reached on the 8th of October. And this deal will have to be implemented consistently. And we said that the devil is in the details. So if we start having several different pieces of legislation, it's going to be bad for everybody. So it's a plain yes. The Commission and Commissioner Gentiloni said it very clearly. They will stick to the agreement. And if they were not to, or if some countries were trying to depart from it, I think they will be stopped, or there would be no agreement. So no big worry here. And I saw in the chat a question on the digital levy, because that's the other EU dimension. Here also, we heard both the President of the Commission as well as Commissioner Gentiloni said that if they move ahead with this own resource, it will be compatible with the deal, which provides for digital service taxes and other relevant similar measures to stand still or to be rolled back. So no big worry on that front either.
Okay, thanks for addressing that. But just to say, I mean, there were reports in the last week, you know, for example, that Poland is a big member state. It's been having a lot of issues with Brussels about rule of law issues in its own country. And it suggested, one of the government ministers, that perhaps it could block, or, you know, the tax deal or EU climate change policies. So, I mean, there is a possibility that some countries could come back and raise questions. As you said there, I know that the Commissioner, Gentiloni, has made it clear that they're confident this will go through. What about you, Minister Donahue? Obviously, you're chairing, you're president of the Eurogroup. Do you think it's a pretty much a done deal when it comes to transposing this into EU law?
I just agree with what Pascal said there a moment ago. If and when, and I expect to see this happen, the Commission come forward with a proposal that is in line with the agreement that Pascal brokered, I would expect that countries will respond positively to it. And while everybody will scrutinise the detail, I believe it will give a good boost to the implementation of this agreement, where we were able to prove that we can collectively implement this leg of it well within Europe. Indeed, it demonstrates yet again the role of the OECD, because what they have done through their work is they have laid down principles that are accepted by member states of the European Union before we even get to the directive phase. So for those reasons, my expectation genuinely is that the Commission will move forward in the way they've indicated to me and they've indicated to others. And I think when that happens, while of course there'll be a lot of scrutiny and a huge amount of evaluation of the directive, I do believe that across next year, there's every prospect of countries responding back positively to us.
Thank you. And just staying with you, Minister, I'm just going to go through the questions now that are coming in. And my journalistic instincts is making me go to a question by a journalist on the chat. So, Minister, you'll be in the spotlight here for a second. There's a question from Jude Webber from the Financial Times. When Janet Yellen visited Ireland recently, she said that some Irish-based businesses had paid, quote, much less than the 15%, than the tax rate. What is the Minister's understanding about how much tax they effectively paid?
So thanks, Jude, for that question. In the information that's provided by the Revenue Commissioner in relation to the effective levels of taxation in the Irish economy, it does demonstrate that the average rate that was paid by companies that are resident here was, I believe, between 11 and 12%. So the average level of taxation is slightly below the 12.5%. Much of that will be due to the use of the two key credits that we have in our tax code. And that may well have been what Secretary Yellen would have been referring to. But if that is what she was referring to, that gap between the nominal tax rate and the effective tax rate is a really small delta in comparison to the delta that would exist in other parts of the world. So if such a gap exists, it would be due to the use of the credits that are in our existing tax code.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, question for Pascal Saint-Amans. this is an interesting one. What are the implications for jurisdictions that are not part of the inclusive framework? And then maybe this is connected. There's another question that's come in here. There's some tax-free or low-tax jurisdictions in the Middle East. What would be the impact on their local companies trading in IF members?
So for those who have not joined the deal, not many. I mean, there are only 4 jurisdictions which are member of the inclusive framework which have not joined the deal, namely Nigeria, Kenya, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan, and we hope they can join. They will just give up additional revenue. They don't have multinational companies headquartered in their jurisdiction. They could have benefited Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. So I would say it's too bad for them, but that's their sovereign choice that we do respect. As regards countries like the Middle East countries, which have low tax, or some of them sometimes no tax, what's the impact? Well, actually, it will level the playing field, because whether they could decide to collect the effective minimum rate or not, one country at the end of the chain, whether the headquarter country or the source country, if the companies are headquartered in UAE or in Saudi Arabia or elsewhere, even though Saudi Arabia does tax through zakat, there will be a collection of the 15% minimum rate. And I would like to add to that the fact that Ireland is an extremely competitive economy because you have labor, because you have skills, because you have a vibrant economy, because you have all factors which will make or will keep making Ireland an extremely attractive destination, while the countries which had an extremely low rate without all the benefits that you will find in Ireland may struggle a bit more with that, which means that this new rule actually will probably also benefit Ireland because of all the attractive environment that you have.
Yeah, on that, Minister, just to come back to you, I mean, you've said quite recently, the Oireachtas Committee, that there is a risk that multinationals could shift their assets out of Ireland as a result of corporate tax changes. You know, are you as optimistic there as Pascal Saint-Amans is about Ireland's continuing competitive advantage?
So, Suzanne, I did indeed make that comment, but in that Oireachtas contribution, by Oireachtas I mean the parliamentary system here in Ireland, I said what I believed is the more likely trigger of the movement of assets out of Ireland could be changes that are made in our own domestic regime, for domestic reasons. And I believe that the framework that we're going to move into and embrace within the OECD is one that Ireland will be competitive within. And while it will change our tax model for competitiveness, I believe there are many other pillars to the Irish economic model that will allow Ireland to be competitive in the future. And it's up to this and future Irish governments to make sure those pillars are strong. Am I optimistic about this? Yes. A question that I've been pressed on a number of times back home here in Ireland now is my view regarding a revenue loss. And for reasons I've contended now over the last couple of years, I do believe the revenue loss that I've indicated in my opening contribution to you will happen here in Ireland as the pillar in relation to the reallocation of taxing rights is globally implemented. But on an overall basis, I believe that we should have cause for optimism regarding the future competitiveness of our economy. And despite that loss in revenue that I do believe will happen, it's absolutely the right thing for our country to be in this agreement and demonstrating that multilateralism, particularly on the hardest of economic issues as this one is, and the process was tough, we have to show it can work. And the process has yielded a compromise that our country will be in and will make the case for.
Just a short question to follow up, which is also on the chat, a kind of more technical question. When will the 15% tax change pass into Irish legislation? How does it work?
So experience has taught me that the shortest questions are frequently the hardest ones, Suzanne, because you tend to demand a short answer in return. But I can deal with that one quite quickly. I'd expect that I'll be dealing with that topic in next year's finance bill. So that will be across October and November of next year. And as you'll know, Suzanne, a feature of our parliamentary regime is that it then gets implemented in the same calendar year. So I'm doing our finance bill at the moment, and assuming everything goes in line with our expectations from the Commission and inside ECOFIN, I'd expect we'll then be dealing with the matter in next year's finance bill.
Okay, thank you. Any of our other panelists want to come in there just on that question of competitiveness? How does this going to, impact business decisions in Ireland and elsewhere?
Yeah, if I may, Suzanne, just follow up slightly. I know, again, some dialogue with companies is asking whether or not there's scope to maybe look at our regime and say, for instance, question whether we still need the multiple rates. So our 25% rate we have, as well as our 12.5, and now there will be a 15% rate, and we have a 33% rate on CGT. So I suppose, might we just move to a more simplification within our corporate tax code? And that would probably expand that concept of simplification, might even go on beyond to things like the interest capping rules that are coming in but are currently being overlaid on existing interest as a charge and things like that. So I don't know, Minister, if you feel that next year's finance bill could become a mammoth bill that incorporates a lot of simplification perhaps into our code as is.
Minister, any comment on that?
I'm just dealing with one wave of corporate tax change at the moment, Kevin. Allow me to get this done before I think about other ones.
Kevin has missed his calling as a journalist, I think.
Pardon me?
Kevin has missed his calling as a journalist there.
Yeah.
Trying to get a line from you there, Minister. Mary, you want to come in there?
Yeah, sorry, I probably sound a bit echoey. I had to change rooms for IT reasons. Yeah, just to say I'd like to support Kevin's call for an Office of Tax Simplification, not just for business taxes, but also as we reduce the capacity of corporation tax competition worldwide, we do need to keep a look on what are the other areas in which there will be competition. So will it be environmental records? Will it be treatment of staff? We need OECD and European Union leadership on this to make sure that those who suffer from this sort of competition aren't the poorest.
Interesting. Just going to shift tack a bit, but it kind of links to what you were saying there, Mary. There's quite a few questions in the chat about climate change. I know, Pascal Saint-Amans, you mentioned this in your introduction. Okay, one question is, we have had just had 2 weeks of climate change talks at COP26. Would a similar structure of annual UN meetings about tax superseding the OECD work? If not, why not? So this idea of having these...
I don't see this. I think we have enough on our plate right now to get this deal properly implemented, to make sure that we have a critical mass of countries, that we level the playing field. The UN can certainly help the least developed countries to cope with the new rules, to catch up with the new rules. But the real question, I think, is on climate change. We had 2 weeks in Glasgow, and I must say I'm extremely frustrated. The words carbon pricing, I think, are not even mentioned in the agreement, when I think we all know that there will be no decarbonization without carbon pricing. So what I see, I hope, is this inclusive framework on carbon pricing being able to bring countries together, to put that on the political radar screen of all the Gs, the G7, the G20, the G whatever, so that countries can really embrace this question. And we know it's a difficult question. Pricing carbon domestically is extremely difficult. You hear my French accent and you've heard about the yellow vests, but it's also an extremely difficult question from a competition perspective. And the border carbon adjustment mechanism planned by the European Union raises many trade questions which are sensitive. We need to bring countries together to work on that. So what I see is probably 2 weeks of inclusive framework on carbon pricing meeting every year, rather than a parallel UN meeting, which takes place, and that's fine.
Minister, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I would very much agree with the spirit of what Pascal said there a moment ago. Firstly, on the role of the United Nations, I mean, they play an essential role from a the perspective of global multilateralism. But I do believe the OECD has comprehensively proven its thought leadership in this area and its ability to deliver multilateral agreements. And again, I want to recognise the role of Pascal in doing that, who was central to it all. And there's so much work ahead now in the technical detail of this agreement and then the implementation of it, that I believe we should allow the OECD to continue with that and not change their role in the global architecture. On carbon pricing, I speak as a minister who's now implemented 3 annual changes in carbon taxes here in Ireland. And I've now legislated to make it an automatic feature of every budget here in Ireland up to the late 2020s. And we simply cannot change our use of carbon unless we're willing to change how we tax it. And I would be very concerned, to build on the analogy that Pascal used at the start of his speech, where he talked about the 2 different options that were open to countries regarding how we deal with difficulties in global tax policy, to either work together or to kind of go on their own and go in their own direction. That prospect is really there now on the taxation of carbon. Because if we can't create a confidence that we're going to move in the same journey together on this path, on how we tax carbon, it opens up the prospect of real potential trade tension, trade difficulty, and great taxation challenges if you have different countries moving at different speeds in this journey, or maybe some not moving at all. I ended my speech with making the case and arguing for a framework about how we think about this across Europe and across the world. And it's something that I'm going to make the case for now in the coming months. I think we would give a very good voice to some of the challenges that are coming out of HOP if we were as a group to decide how we can move forward with this challenge.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else want to come on that? I've plenty more questions here, which is fine, but just to say, it's obviously a huge issue at European level now, as you mentioned the yellow vest there, Pascal, but as the Minister knows from chairing the Eurogroup, lots of worried by political leaders around Europe about how to respond at the moment to high energy prices and the kind of fiscal impact of those. Another is changing tack a bit here, and this is another question for Pascal Sinnamon. If the US is not able to pass the Pillar 1 measures through its legislature, or if the version of Pillar 1 that is passed is materially different from the OECD's, what might be the potential impact on the OECD's Pillar 1 proposals?
I mean, the first answer, and I think that's what all the countries which have negotiated the deal with the US, is that the working assumption is that the US will ratify the deal. We all know that the US has a different system from the others. It's not a parliamentary system, and what the administration commits to is not necessarily what Congress or the Senate will ratify. So we'll see. But the current working assumption is that this Pillar 1 will pass, the multilateral convention will be ratified. And if I may add a couple of additional remarks. The first one is that fundamentally, even though bipartisanship is not in great shape in the US, as we know, but this issue is largely bipartisan, the Pillar 1 issue. I mean, it's the Trump administration which reopened the negotiation back in 2017 as regards Pillar 1. And by the way, the idea of a minimum tax, guilty, was introduced by a Republican administration. And it's the Republican administration itself which said we must negotiate at the OECD, and they themselves mentioned the idea of a multilateral convention. So in spite of bipartisanship being, again, in poor shape in the US, the fundamentals are not bad. Second, and I think Mary made the point in her initial remarks, this is a historic deal, and I think a page has been turned, and whether it is ratified immediately, which is the working assumption, and when I say working assumption, we work on that, for that, with the US and with the other countries in the design of the multilateral convention. But if it were not to be approved immediately, I think it wouldn't take too long, because if you look at the political economy of the reform, the fact that you have a limited number of companies impacted, which means that in the US system, you remove the negative lobbying from thousands of companies, and that the in-scope companies, most of them are in favor, are asking for this solution, you can see that the odds are actually pretty positive, even though it's a legitimate question. But instead of responding what would happen if they don't ratify, I'm telling you we're working for this to be ratified.
Okay, positive. Minister, just a final question for you. We're close to finishing up, although there's still a lot of questions. This is from RTE, from Will Goodbody. Just a clarification question, really. Is the Minister, is your reference to the €2 billion tax loss to Exchequer in your opening remarks, is that a new revised figure drawn up by the Department of Finance and Revenue since Ireland joined the deal, or is that the old figure and work is continuing and establishing whether it'll be more or less than that?
So it's the old figure. It's the figure I've used now over the last 18 to 24 months. And my expectation is that it'll be the second quarter of next year until we have enough sight of the technical detail, particularly in relation to the reallocation of taxing rights, before we have an opportunity to review that figure and the necessary detail to reassess it. So it's the same figure that I've used now for some time. I'd expect we'll be in a position to update it at that point next year. And Suzanne, at this point, I'm afraid I have to go. I have to go back to this year's finance bill before Kevin has me thinking about next year's one. And I have 2 cabinet subcommittees that I have to go to this afternoon. So I hope you'll bear with me if I leave at this point. And I just want to say that the whole seminar was worth attending, just to hear the enthusiasm of Mary Cosgrove for it earlier on when she talked about this. It reminded me of, I think it was Wordsworth, who said, to be alive was heaven, to be young was sheer bliss. And I couldn't help but think of that when I heard Mary speak about this tax agreement in that way.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister, for taking the time and being with us for the duration. Thank you. And just a couple of more questions we're just going to squeeze in. Just another kind of technical one, and just bear with me. Again, it's for Pascal. Or maybe actually, Kevin, you might come in on this. Just bear with me. Yeah, Pillar 2. So Pillar 2 will be implemented under national rules, but there's no international treaty on this. What mechanisms are seen for dispute resolution from issues that may arise?
So if you want me to comment first, I suppose for me, it's more, I think that is of interest to business again, because at the end of the day, even when we talk about having models and having directives, etc., from the EU, I think even when we've seen some of the more recent ATAD directives come through, to get it into domestic legislation, you often still have tweaks, slight tweaks, nuances, but they are still there. And so when you think of a multinational that's in thousands of jurisdictions, hundreds of jurisdictions, and each tweak, you need to go out and then see, what does it mean? How do I get my calculation in, and what do I do? And of course, these disputes, I think, are going to be there for the next decade. It's just inevitable, it would seem, between tax authorities. But exactly how we deal with that without an instrument, I'd be delighted to hear from Pascal Saint-Amans.
Pascal, any thoughts on that?
So you're right, P2 will be implemented through domestic legislations, which by themselves do not provide for international dispute resolution. However, as you will have seen in the detailed implementation plan, we intend to also have something like a multilateral instrument or framework to facilitate the proper implementation of Pillar 2 and reduce possible tensions. Now, if a country were to implement Pillar 2 in a rogue manner, which would go beyond its own rights to tax, it would probably be contrary to tax treaties, and there you could trigger the current mutual agreement procedures and so. But we are fully aware of some possible tension here. Thus, the agreement to establish a framework to limit the tensions on the implementation of Pillar 2.
Okay. Any final thoughts, Monica and Mary? Monica, any final thoughts for our viewers on where this is going and what you're looking out for now as this progresses?
Yeah, thank you, Suzanne. No, I think U.S. multinationals, right, are just watching this, as I mentioned before, very closely. We have two dynamics at play, right? The global deal and how the implementation details are set forward, looking to the rest of the world in terms of that implementation. And then from a U.S. standpoint, what we're working through right now in Washington on potential U.S. tax reform. Seems that we may have lost Suzanne.
Okay, well,
there
she's
she
coming back there, I think.
You're back, Suzanne.
I don't know what happened here. I'm suspiciously close to the European Commission. Maybe they're a firewall or something. So, Mary, you were about to come in there.
Sorry, yeah, just to say, I suppose this is historic. In many ways, it is giving business certainty, but the realities of it, the finer points as it gets implemented, means that businesses won't be expecting their tax compliance bill to drop any year soon. Plenty of jobs for my graduates for the next while, but just even on the much broader horizon, I think we're going to see these calls for greater inclusivity, greater power to the developing nations, the source nations coming, and I think over time, I think the concept of residence in corporation tax will lose all meaning as such, that we're going to end up with these formulas on where activity happens.
Just final word to you, Kevin, on that. Any final thoughts for our viewers?
I probably am maybe not quite where Mary was there on that residence will cease and that everything will go formulaic. I think that concept has been out for some time, but I do appreciate where Mary's coming from on that, and more than happy to have her graduates come our way and speak to us. We'd be delighted to have them on board. Final thoughts for me. I just think we're really into the business end of this. As we all say, it's historic, it's wonderful political achievement that is going on here. But yeah, the next couple of months, the next year, a huge amount of work to be done. And I don't know, I think maybe yourself, Pascal Sinnamon, had talked about how tax is to become boring, etc. But I certainly don't see anything boring coming out of this for some time yet. So thank you on that.
Okay, thanks for that, Kevin. Final thoughts. So thank you very much to all our panelists for this really interesting discussion and broad range of discussion. Thank you for all the questions that were sent in for viewers, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Goodbye.